Hello friends, it's breezy. I hope the audio is okay with this video. We, believe it or not, have not had an actual first frost yet. Typically we've had one weeks ago by now. We had one night that got down to 0 for maybe less than an hour, and just the very top of the cucamelon trellis got touched by frost, but the dahlias are still going strong here. But in about 3 days, I think we are going to have our actual first frost, and I kind of want to get a head start at digging some of the dahlias. But before we do that, one of the things that I like to do before we get a frost is inspect the plants and see if there are any that I need to cull. Viruses are pretty prevalent in the dahlia world. In particular, there's two that I think are mainly responsible. There's dahlia mosaic virus, and then there's also a tobacco virus, TSV. And those together are responsible for the majority of the virus issues. And there have been a few studies the last few years and testing programs, and it's estimated about 3/4 of dahlias actually have viruses. Sometimes those viruses don't present physically. They're easy to miss or not visible at all unless you do testing, which can be quite expensive, especially for home gardeners. But if it's something that's obvious in my dahlias, it's something I want to eliminate and eradicate. So let's go do a tour and see if we can find some issues. So one thing you want to look for is stunting in its growth pattern. So, this is quite a large dahlia right here, right next to a small dahlia. But I know that this one was planted quite late in the season. This was planted about 6 weeks later than these taller, larger dahlias behind it. So that's not something that I'm worried about. When I look at the foliage, it's nice and green. I don't see any markings on it. It doesn't look like it's suffering. Once you do find discolored leaves, which is an indicator of virus, it can be hard to distinguish from a nutrient deficiency. So there's some things that you look for. So that's this dahlia. This dahlia was planted around the same time. Now, I don't see it. It's a little yellower. You can see that it's a little yellower, but I don't see one of the characteristic visual signs, I guess, of disease is yellowing veins, and I don't see any of that here. This could just be like a damaged tuber that had like a really late start. But if we move over here, this is about the same size as the first plant we looked at over there. But if you look at some of the foliage, you can see that there is some yellow discoloration. I hope you can see this. This looks like some mottling. That could be characteristic of a mosaic virus. There's no yellow veins. This might be one that I may not call right now, but I will separate and watch it very closely next year. It could be just a nutrient deficiency, but it's something that worries me enough that I will keep an eye on this. Now this is an example. This is wine-eyed Jill. She's not looking very wine-eyed, but probably for good reason. This is definitely diseased. The leaves are deformed. They are chlorotic, which means they are very yellow, and there's like a mottling pattern The veins are not yellow, but this to me looks like it could be definitely a case of mosaic virus. Some of the new growth, it's interesting, looks kind of normal. Sometimes it's hard to see disease until things slow down and cool off in the fall, because new growth can actually outgrow some of these symptoms, and it isn't really apparent until the fall when, you know, there's less sun, the temperatures are cooler, and the plants aren't growing quite as quickly. But this is one that definitely will not be making it to next year. This is a plant that will get thrown in the garbage. Now, this is something that might look concerning. There's a lot of misshapen growth here. However, if you look beyond that, there's also an awful lot of caterpillar and earwig damage. So everything else otherwise looks healthy. Most of the older leaves look, you know, okay. These growth points, if bugs get in there while they're growing, that can cause this deformity. So this is one that I'm going to watch next year as well. And how I separate what I want to watch and what I think is safe is when I go around this time of year, I add tags. So if I add a red tag, it's something I want to watch and keep separate from everything else. And if I think it's okay, I add a yellow tag or a different color tag. But that's just, you know, a visual reminder when I'm digging them up to keep the red tags separate from the yellow tags. So unfortunately, we do have a few issues. The other thing that you want to watch for when you're digging up your dahlias in the fall is crown gall and leafy gall. So far, everything we've talked about have been viruses, but these are bacterial infections. There's no cure for any of these things. So if you find either of those two things, those are also, throw them out. All of these things will spread to not only your other dahlias, but a lot of these things, you know, can infect other flowers, plants, crops as well. So best not to keep them around. For the price of a replacement, it's a small price to pay to, you know, keep your other perennials and other things, other dahlias safe. I haven't personally seen crown gall show up in any of my plants yet. I'm sure, as you know, every year I bring a few new dahlias in, and every year I lose a few. That's just the nature of the game. But I'm sure, you know, one of these years I will run across it, and when I do, I will show you. I have had leafy gall. I don't think I had any last year. The 2 previous years I did find plants and threw them out right away. And if I find any this year, I will definitely show you what that looks like. But there are pictures of all of these things online. If you Google them and look them up, you can see pictures of everything. There's also some really good presentations on YouTube. The Washington State University has a researcher that has looked into a lot of these diseases with dahlias, and I know there is a presentation from him available on YouTube. If I can find it again, I'll link it in the description. But let's dig one dahlia and see how it's doing. I haven't dug anything yet, and it's kind of like Christmas, you know, waiting to see what things are going to look like. All right, I've decided to dig up old Snow Hoe Doris here, and she doesn't have any new blooms coming, or none that are going to be ready, you know, in 3 days. So this is a good candidate for me to check. It's also in a raised bed, so all the dahlias that I have in ground near the house, those I will dig up with a pitchfork, but I think I can get away with just a spade because she's in some nice loose raised bed soil. So the first thing that I'm going to want to do here is chop off the stalk here and pull out the stake. or break it, you know, whichever. So I've left about a 6-inch handle here, and I might even be able to kind of dig this out with my hands. You don't want to damage the tubers or break any necks while you do this. So I'm going to clip off a lot of these roots. Just cleaning this bit up will make this a lot less intimidating of a clump to deal with. Okay, so I like to wash my tubers off, so I've got this one all washed off. This darker tuber here is the mother tuber. Sometimes you're able to save those year to year in your storage along with your other tubers, sometimes you're not. I always try. It's a little disappointing the size of some of these tubers, but like I said, and you guys have heard me complain about all summer, we've had a year. So these are definitely, a lot of these are large enough to store. You're generally looking for something bigger than like a AA battery. So even this one is probably borderline, but possible. So we've got some that we can work with here. So the next step is I will leave this outside to dry off, probably on my covered front porch, possibly overnight. It's about 4 o'clock in the afternoon. So I may not get to it tonight. I want to make sure this is dry to the touch. You don't want these tubers to dry out. You want them to retain their moisture, and they will dry out fairly quickly, but you don't want them to be wet on the outside when we start dividing them. Okay, here we are a few days later. I had this wrapped in plastic in the fridge for a few days while we were away for the weekend. I've got my Sharpie and my shears ready to go here. The first thing that I always like to do when dividing a clump is to chop off the stalk as close down to the crown where the tuber's attached to the stalk as possible without actually harming that crown. I find this gives a better visual, and one of the first things that I usually do is have a good look and see if there's a place that I can divide the clump in half. That gives you like a cut side to start working from. And sometimes you end up having to sacrifice a tuber or two, but as you practice and you get going with this, that will become less and less stressful. Generally, for the most of us, this is not our livelihoods, and the goal is to overwinter a couple of viable tubers, so I don't worry about losing one here and there. And in the last clip, you probably noticed me chopping off a couple of these small tubers right off the bat. There's no point in trying to save something that is too small. You know, I think as newbies, we all try and we all learn the hard way that, you know, they just don't overwinter. Even if the tuber manages to make it through, a lot of these necks are quite small and spindly and will dry out. So I'm sacrificing a tuber here and there in order to, you know, give myself the best chance with a nice duo like this one right here. The next thing I'm going to do is make sure I get this labeled before I move on to the next clump or the next division. I want to minimize mixed up tubers wherever possible. It makes it a lot easier to know what you actually have, what is successful in overwintering, and it helps plan your garden the next year. As the winter goes on, I'll check these and I'll be able to, you know, plan out my dahlia beds next year based on what I have and how many of different things that I want. I'm just going to continue dividing here. I'm being careful to check too for rot up where the tubers meet the crown. Sometimes there can be dark areas. That's generally a sign of rot. And if you see that, you want to make sure that you get that removed, because it will continue to spread throughout the winter and can ruin an otherwise viable tuber if you don't catch it early on. Cinnamon can also be helpful. I haven't dug it out yet. This is just my first division this year, and I haven't dug all my supplies out. But when I get a lot of, here you can see I found a little bit of rot. You can see that dark spot going down the center there. I'm going to cut that out. But on a lot of these cuts, if you sprinkle cinnamon, that can help deter rot throughout the winter. And I will apply that to a lot of the cut areas once the major dividing happens this year. Okay, here I have the mother tuber. You can tell it's usually darker, a little more gnarly looking. And in this case, it's labeled from last year, which you can still make out. But I like to put a big M on them so that I know that this was a mother tuber. It's going to be more prone to rotting than this year's tubers. There's a lot of people that don't bother trying to save these. Sometimes I do, sometimes I don't. A lot of these tubers are on the smaller side, and I just want to give myself the best chance at getting these tubers to overwinter. I just need one to be viable in most cases, unless it's a real favorite and I want to plant multiple. I mean, I would plant multiples of all of them. I just don't have the space, you know, for multiples. I think I have around 55 varieties this year, so it's just not possible. You can see on this mother tuber, I cut off the end of it too. That is to check for rot. If there were brown areas, generally they happen in the center of the tuber. You can't really tell from the outside when it's just starting. But if you catch it now, you increase your odds at that tuber surviving. So I will add cinnamon to that cut where it is a large cut, and before I pack them away for storage. So I'll get the rest of these labeled up, and I'm just going to lay them out, like I said, on the top of this, vermiculite in this bin until those cuts dry over. Some of those larger areas I will add cinnamon to. Sometimes I sprinkle cinnamon right in with the vermiculite. Sometimes I don't, just depends how much I have on hand and how lazy I'm feeling, I guess, that day. But that is just the beginning of the, dahlia digging season. So I hope you found this useful. Definitely go check out that video that I made last year. It goes a lot more into depth with how I divide. And I hope you enjoyed this. And I have a couple videos ready to go here soon of some more dahlias blooming in my garden. So I hope you come back for that as well. Have a great day, and we will see you next time.